Oh, sorry, I should have talked about that now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our conversation series that we're hosting here at NAPUP. And today we have the privilege and the honor and the fun and joy of co-hosting with Moms Rising, an amazing organization that's committed to organizing families and moms, especially to create a better world for all of us, especially moms and families. And so as we get started, just want to remind you that this is a part of a series that we have been running. Last week, we had an amazing conversation hosted by another amazing partner of ours, Tavai Samuelu, who's the executive director of Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, and talking about Pacific Islanders and militarism and the impact of U.S. militarism in their native land. And today we are hosting a conversation, again, in partnership with Moms Rising, about the impact of COVID and this pandemic on Asian American families, Asian American and Pacific Islander families especially. And so we have folks who identify as moms, as educators, as mental health professionals who will be joining us on this panel, which will be moderated by Gloria Pan of Moms Rising. And Gloria is a force to be reckoned with. She is she leads the membership engagement at Moms Rising and leads on their gun control campaign and work. And prior to coming to Moms Rising, she was a principal for internet communications strategy at Turner Strategies and has done a lot of amazing things online, including conceiving and helping found an influential 2009 FEM 2.0 conference and FEM 2.0 online community. So Gloria brings so much wisdom, talent, and passion to her work at Moms Rising. And she is, I'm sorry, she speaks Mandarin, Chinese, and Japanese and French as well, and holds degrees in political economy from Barnard College in New York City and Sophia University in Tokyo, Japan. So I'm going to turn it over to Gloria now, who will be introducing the panelists and facilitating the rest of our conversation today.
Thanks, Sun-Young. Thanks for a great introduction. So to members of the Moms Rising community who are joining us today, hello. And to members of the NAPUP community and everyone else, it's really wonderful to meet you. And in case you're not familiar with Moms Rising, let me tell you a little bit something about us. So Moms Rising, we're a national and online organization of more than 1 million moms and family members joining together to build a nation where everyone can thrive. We're intersectional and we work on multiple fronts ranging from paid sick days and family leave to access to healthcare, immigration reform, and gun violence prevention. Much of our work is focused on racial justice and equity. But of course, we've all seen the disturbing videos of street harassment and violence against Asian Americans. The Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism found that starting from the first quarter of 2020, anti-Asian hate crimes surged by 169%. But to be clear, the current targeting of Asian Americans is nothing new. Asian American racism and violence has a long history in America, from the Page Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act to the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, to Trump's race-baiting references to COVID as the Chinese virus. So Sun-Young and I were on a conversation a few weeks ago together, and I was really appalled to hear about the coronavirus tag, where the Asian American kid is it. So the coronavirus tag is just another way to reinforce harmful stereotypes and promote otherization and divisiveness. And it's really sad that this kind of thing starts with children at such a young age. Regardless of color, ethnicity, religion, or gender identity, no child should ever feel unsafe or otherized, which is why we're here today, to hear from Asian American moms, educators, mental health experts, and to learn from their personal experiences and expertise. How can we talk to children to humanize Asian Americans or any group of people perceived to be different from themselves? How can we fight bullying, racism, and otherization? And how can we work with our school systems to create an inclusive, welcoming environment for all children. So May is Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and I'm really glad to be here today to help shine a spotlight on the Asian American community and to also find lessons and insights on how to build a more perfect union for all America's many, many communities. And I'm really excited to be here with our amazing panelists. So I'm just gonna go ahead and introduce them. First off, there's Nadia Hussein, who is my colleague and friend. She is a senior campaign director at MomsRising, focusing on national early learning policy. She is a co-founder of the Bangladeshi American Women's Development Initiative, a community initiative empowering Bangladeshi women and girls in New Jersey. She's also currently serves on the National Board of Directors of the American Civil Liberties Union as the affiliate representative from New Jersey. Last November, we were really excited that Nadia was elected to the Board of Education for Bloomingdale Public Schools in New Jersey. Nadia is a passionate cat lady and a mom to two rambunctious little boys. And then this is my first time meeting the amazing Estella Oweema-Church. Estella is a first-generation American of Samoan and Nigerian descent. Born and raised in South Los Angeles, she serves in her hometown as a secondary theater teacher. Estella is a proud mother of a 7-year-old M.I.T. prospect with dreams of being a computer programmer, and she wears many hats, but her most important hat is raising a child who is free to dream and to be her full self unapologetically. In 2017, she was named a finalist for the Global Teachers Prize, now hailed as the Nobel for Educators. And then we have Sharon Kwon. Sharon is a psychotherapist for Asian American, BIPOC, and immigrant populations struggling with racial trauma and identity at Yellow Chair Collective. She is also a psychiatric social worker in Los Angeles, providing mental health assessments for foster families and youth. She's experienced working with elementary, middle, and high school teens at LAUSD schools and private schools in the Los Angeles area. She facilitates support groups for teens and parents seeking support due to the rise of anti-Asian racism, and she writes about mental health and has been featured on the Huffington Post. And last but not least, we have our fearless leader from Napov, Sunyoung Choimaro. Sunyoung leads Napov as executive director, and she was born in South Korea and spent her childhood in Singapore and India. She came to the United States at the age of 18 to study political science and urban studies at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, and she earned a master's in divinity from McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. She is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church. Sun Young is a working mom who is passionate about building power to create change so her daughter can live in a more just world than the one she inherited. So I'm so honored to be with such accomplished women tonight. Before we launch into our panel discussion, I just want to say to our watchers and listeners, throughout our discussion, please feel free to share your thoughts and questions below, and we're going to try to leave room at the end of our discussion to respond. So, panelists, all of you, we've heard all of your official bios, and I've done my best to introduce you. My first question to all of you is, how do you want to show up in this space, in this discussion? As a mom, as an educator or board of education member, why is this conversation important to you? So I'm just going to call on Sun Young to lead us off.
Thanks. So actually, Gloria, you mentioned the conversation, the interaction we had, and the first time I heard about the coronavirus tag that kids are playing in the schoolyard really had me thinking a lot about what more we really need to do for our students, especially as they're heading back to school in person, and how things that are so seemingly quote unquote harmless are doing damage, whether it's implicitly or explicitly to our children. And I really felt very passionately that I needed to talk to as many moms as possible and share that story, because it's so appalling, right? Like it's tagged, like it's the thing that kids just do, but somehow they turned it into a racist thing, right? And the fact that, like, I wonder how many kids played in the playground and it goes unnoticed because no one is calling somebody a name, no one is crying, no one is bullying. And so, schools tend to intervene if there's like a behavioral or like a disciplinary issue. And I really felt strongly that we need to go beyond that as parents, as educators, to create an environment where all of our children can flourish. And so today I'm showing up as a parent advocate who likes to often show up at our Board of Education meetings to make sure that we are fighting for all of our children.
Thanks. And how about you, Nadia? How are you showing up today?
Well, I'm glad I'm showing up at all because you could probably hear my child screaming in the background. But I will say I'm a parent advocate that ended up running for a position on our local Board of Education because I wanted to see parents' voices uplifted. I wanted to see diverse voices uplifted in my own community. And so I still consider myself an advocate, although now I'm on the other side of the desk. And I will say that, any comments or statements I make tonight are personal comments and statements, are not reflective on the Bloomingdale Board of Education. I just want to make that clear. And I will say, I am speaking as somebody who is a parent advocate. I am speaking as somebody who, serves in an elected capacity to ensure that all kids get the best education, the best experiences they can in a public school system. I also speak as somebody who is an Asian American who grew up in lots of different school districts. I was born in the United States and raised here, but I lived in many different places. And I will say that not every school experience was the same. And I definitely did experience a lot of, unfortunately, maybe not coronavirus tag, but I definitely did experience a lot of, frankly, racist rhetoric and isolation and things like that because of just because of my name and who I look like. So I do bring in that experience. And I also bring in my different hats of, I co-founded the Bangladeshi American Women's Group, the experience of that community in COVID is not an experience that is often heard or uplifted, even within the Asian American experience.
Thanks, Nadia. How about you, Sharon? It's nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too, and thank you so much for having me. So, growing up not as a parent, but as an advocate for children. So a lot of my work is with children, teens, and young adults and their parents. And my role as a therapist is often to bridge the gap between parents and children. So it's really important for me to hear how Asian American parents are coping and the struggles they're facing in supporting their kids right now, because I want to understand, what the entire family is going through and the different struggles that every member of the family is facing right now.
Okay, so hold that thought. We're going to have Estella tell us how are you showing up today, and then we're going to go back to your last thought. Estella, hi.
Hi. I will say that I'm showing up tonight as everything that you mentioned, both an extension of my ancestors that have come before and a bridge to the kids that I serve day in and day out. And to do that or show that, I will formally introduce myself in Samoan. Malo lava le paia ma le mamalu ale mai maunga te te'e se I o I ta tofanau I ti I ta lofalava. O lo ingoa Estella Oweema-Church o te sau mai a tunu o Tongva I ala I Savai'i Samoa and o Calabar, Nigeria. And my pronouns are she, her, uso. So in short, I thank you women for being in this space and for the sanctity and dignity of this association. And from the highest mountains to the smallest hills, I say greetings. And I acknowledge my ancestors from Savai'i, Samoa and Calabar, Nigeria. And also acknowledge that the land I am coming to you virtually from is the land of the Tongva people. And Ma'us Tavae Samuelu reminds me to say temporarily known as Los Angeles. So that the day we're ready to give that land back, this land back, we remember the original stewards of this land and we can hand it over to them. I'm also here tonight to lean in and hear from all of you as well. But similar to Nadia, very much parent advocate. My husband and I wear many hats in our daughter's school district. And showing up at every committee meeting, DPEC, ELAC, all the acronyms, trying to do everything that we can to support her and other students. But also by extension, my colleagues. I consider the teachers in her district colleagues as well. And so I want to do everything I can to support my daughter during this pandemic, but also make sure that her teachers have the supports they need so that they can show up and be their best selves for her as well.
Thank you, Estella. So I am also a mom, but my children are older. So I think that my pandemic experience has been slightly easier. They came home from college, so I had to keep cooking, which I didn't like. Right? However, I did not have to juggle online school the way that the moms here probably did. So how has the pandemic experience been for you all? Nadia, I mean, on our meetings, I frequently see your son in the background, and he is so charming, but I know that it hasn't been easy.
I'm glad he seems charming on video. So, I will say, my son, when he was in pre-K, he had an IEP. And for those that don't know what that is, it's kind of a special education classification, right? And so he aged out of it right as he was getting into kindergarten because the pandemic started while he was still in pre-K. And it was extremely challenging and I had just had a baby, so I had a baby during the pandemic too. So the baby was only a few months old. Literally his school stopped right as I gave birth. So we had to do online learning while I was juggling a newborn. And at least I was very lucky to have maternal leave, right? But once that ended, I had to kind of come back. I luckily worked from home, but I frankly had to go part-time at MomsRising because of the demands of virtual education. My son was just not the child who could just sit down nicely with whatever crayons and paper and do his work. He refused to even sit in front of the camera. So I called his guidance counselor crying hysterically. I called his teacher crying hysterically. And I was like, I know you're not my therapist, but I don't know what to do because he's driving you crazy and he's driving me crazy and we're both trying to make this work, right? So it was very challenging. I realized I have immense privilege and luck in that I am able to work at a place that understood that challenge, like MomsRising being really living out our values, and it gave me that space to take part-time pay, and also legislation. The CARES Act enabled me to be able to get paid full-time, frankly, while I did this virtual learning. And I bought a what is it called? Someone sent me a stuffed animal, like support animal, like a shark that I used. I was making voices, so Secure had friends. So I was making voices with different animals to help him through school. And then I was also making the voices when I wasn't in school. So I was just, I think, losing my mind. So yes, it was extremely challenging. But I also know, and I've heard from other communities, the Bangladeshi community, I live in a suburban environment. A lot of communities in places that are much more crowded, like a city, they were just losing people. I mean, people were dying of COVID in our Bangladeshi community in New York City and Patterson. Extremely traumatizing, and children were trying to go to school while this was happening, living in multi-generational households. So even if it was challenging for me, that was just the tip of the iceberg of a lot of the trauma that our communities were facing.
And how about you, Sonia? You're leading an entire organization. How has the juggle been?
So I think Nadia's son's the same age as my daughter. I was like, oh yeah, preschool to kindergarten. I mean, it was challenging, right? Because we went from having 10 hours of care to no hours of care overnight. I still remember, calling my daughter was in preschool, calling the school saying on Friday, saying, are you sure you're going to be open on Monday? They're like, oh yeah, of course we're going to be open on Monday. Then the governor issued an order on Friday night or something. And we hadn't heard from the school. So we're like, what does that mean? Do we send her to school? So we were on the way to school, and then we get an email, and I'm calling my husband saying, come back home because she doesn't have, just the whole chaos of the initial, and then now we're stuck at home with with each other for 24/7, right? My daughter has never spent this much time with me, vice versa, since she was 6 weeks old when I ran out of parental leave and had to go back to work, right? So it's really exposed this whatever little measly social safety net parents had, who frankly, I'm in the privileged few who can afford to send my daughter to 10 hours of preschool a day so that I can work, right? All of a sudden we have none of these options available. And really the toughest part has been helping her with the transitions and the coping and like, you know, like she's in therapy right now. Like she's been in therapy actually since the beginning of the pandemic because she would sing these songs to herself to sleep and they were getting pretty depressing and morbid. Like, you know, and it was like her way of dealing with like what was going on around her, which she didn't know very much about. And she was very upset she didn't get to hug her, you know, preschool, you graduate, right? Like she didn't get to hug her teacher goodbye. They missed their big spring concert where the graduating kids get to sing a special song. Like these things that she had been looking forward to the last couple of years being in preschool, she finally was supposed to do and she didn't get to do. So we were dealing with a lot of loss with that. And then my parents were supposed to come spend a summer with us and they couldn't come. And so she was very upset about that. And then like Zoom kindergarten starts and that's like a whole nother, I mean, my hat's off to the teachers, but like, oh my goodness, like, you know, at the beginning, like the teacher's like holding up the form, like, can you find this piece of paper? Because these are kindergartners, they can't read, right? Like you can't tell them like, find this worksheet because they don't know what that means. And so literally she's like holding up worksheets to the camera, like trying to get the kids to find the right worksheet. Like it's impossible, right? Like parents and educators have been put in an impossible situation. And, you know, as I see moms, you know, my friends who are parenting other countries, like I am just appalled at how we have failed our children in this country, right? Like we opened up bars and gyms before we opened up schools. That's appalling to me, right? That's how we prioritize health and safety and education of our children. And, you know, people are like, oh, kids will bounce back, they're resilient. That's true. And this is going to leave a mark on all of our children.
So how about you, Estella? You're actually a teacher. How has it been? You have a child at home and trying to teach. What's it been like?
I definitely, a lot of that resonates. My daughter transitioned from kindergarten to first grade during this pandemic. So we went from her being a little kid to a big kid during this, you know, that transition. I mean, we had to throw her graduation in the driveway to like make it feel like kindergarten had ended and now she's a big kid. I will first begin by acknowledging I'm extremely privileged to have a partner at home that is helping keep her like out of my classroom while you know, while I'm trying to teach and be on with my high schoolers. I've spent the last 2 weeks talking to colleagues and friends, and a lot of the conversations are trying to just get each other to the last period of the day and keep each other from walking away from the profession totally and completely. Because we have been asked to do triple duty. The second this pandemic started, and everyone went home here in California, SoCal, it was March 12th, school shut down, we were all at home by the 13th. Everybody was, yay, teachers, like we understand what you do now, and thank you so much. And 6 months in, it was, you're terrible, what's wrong with you? Hurry up and get back into the classroom. And not once has anyone acknowledged that just like the families we serve, we too are dealing with loss and tragedy. And there was a point in the first semester, the fall semester, where I was juggling planning several funerals for friends, virtual funeral services, with trying to also lesson plan. And that has not been, there's not been space for that grief to breathe. There's not been time or acknowledgement. It's just been, what's wrong with you lazy teachers? Get back in the classroom because the economy has to get moving again. And teachers, this entire time, we've been, you know, different unions across the country have been threatening protest or protesting, and all we've been asking for is an equitable, safe reopen. But what we're also asking is that folks acknowledge we never stopped working. The assumption that because we are at home, we have not been teaching or we have not been doing our regular jobs is a farce, is disrespectful, and it's hurtful. Because I've been at this computer screen. I'm here 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, and I often don't walk away from my computer until 11 p.m., midnight. There are days where I'm at my computer till 1 a.m. because suddenly, I mean, before the pandemic, teachers struggled with boundaries. That's like a regular thing. You know, when do we not respond to parents or not respond to students? And the second the pandemic hit, any boundary we were ever able to create in our careers disintegrated. Like it was over. Text messages, emails, phone calls, nonstop. Throughout the pandemic, I mean, and little tiny logistics things that I don't think anybody has really considered, but our electricity bills have doubled. The Wi-Fi bills, we've had to upgrade all of our systems to be able to be online with students all day long. Um, that, like, we're not being reimbursed for any of those costs. We're being asked to take on the load of, I have 150 students daily, and I'm taking on all of that, their pain, their loss, their grief. I have students who are working that I know if we return physically, which we have, there are kids that are going to drop out. And I haven't heard a conversation about what this dropout rate is going to look like. Because why, if I'm 17 and I have to make the choice between helping to support my family or go back to the physical campus, there is no choice there. I'm gonna do what I have to do to support my family and my loved ones. And so it's been a nonstop year and a half of trauma without nothing. This teacher appreciation week was a joke. Like it was an absolute joke. I wish we could have just like canceled it. Like go ahead, McDonald's, keep that free cup of coffee. Like it's not serving any of us, and it's what I'm looking for are really open and honest and brave conversations about what a safe reopen looks like for Brown, Black, Indigenous, Asian, Pacific Islander students. And what we have right now with all the schools that have reopened, there is no equity on the table. We're asking teachers, support staff, paraprofessionals, nurses, all of you, forget your lives, your loved ones, whether you're immunocompromised, your babies, put your life on the line for everyone else, show up, but also let's not even really think about what students are going to have to deal with when they come back to the campus. We just need you back on campus.
That's actually a great segue into our next question. So first of all, Estella, I want to say that I'm sure that everyone here on this panel discussion has so much appreciation and love for teachers, and thank you so much for the work that you do. But we are at a time now that we are looking at schools reopening, and many students have actually started returning to the classrooms. And so statistics show, though, that AAP families are least likely to have their children return to school in person during this time. So why is that happening? Why do you think this is happening? So Sharon, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. So Asian Americans, we are the fastest growing minority in the country. And a lot of us are first or second generation, and many of these immigrants they're still living in the survival mode where they're expecting the worst at every turn. And they haven't been able to work through a lot of intergenerational trauma and are therefore suffering from symptoms of mental illness like high anxiety, worry, and fear. So it's not surprising to me that Asian American parents are sensing even more danger than before. I mean, it's on the news, it's everywhere, they are a target. And so naturally, I mean, they just want to protect their children from harm. I think it's just an instinctual feeling as a parent that senses all of this danger that's going on to want to keep their baby safe.
So we're right now in a moment where Asian Americans are in general feeling very unsafe. So Sun-Young, do you want to like talk a little bit about that and maybe like pull that into like how that impacts our kids and how they can re-enter the school system. I mean, how are parents thinking? I think there's just like a lot of anxiety in all of our communities, right? We're seeing the news about the surge in anti-Asian violence and hate. And then in our own lives, we're feeling unsafe because, maybe we have people working on the front lines as essential workers or in healthcare. And now, we're dealing with our children, and now we're thinking about sending them back to school, but it's just like almost too much. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think to Sharon's point, it's a lot to do. I mean, just like layer upon layer upon layer, right? And NAPAF commissioned a polling of Asian American women voters. This was the largest survey of its kind at the beginning of this year. And 78% of the people who answered who were polled said that racial discrimination or racism is having an impact on them right now, right? So the fact that, I was shocked that many Asian American Pacific Islander identify and can name racism as a factor that's impacting them. Of the people surveyed, 68% said that they had experienced some sort of street harassment in the last 24 months. And that of that percentage, about 60% say they know that they're dealing with mental health issues because of it, right? Whether it's anxiety, depression. And so if you have people who are able to name this at these high percentages, it is not a surprise that we are seeing the hesitancy of returning to school. To me, what's also a really big factor, and this is something that I'm trying to figure out how to engage my school district in, is that so much of this quote unquote safety measures really is around preventing violence and bullying, right? And even prior to the pandemic, many Asian American children, and this is the problem with how Asian Americans experience racism, right? Like people are like, well, but that's not really racism, right? That like the way we get discriminated against doesn't kind of rise to the level of hate crime or hate violence, and so it doesn't get treated as seriously. So for example, I have a friend whose daughter had an incident at school where these white boys made fun of her lunch and was like, ew, you eat cats. I know you Chinese people eat cats, and made fun of her, right? The school didn't take it serious. They're like, oh, they're just being, made them apologize, but they didn't see it as a racial incident. They just saw it as boys being silly and making fun of a girl, right? Like, and I think that's also playing into part of the fear of returning kids back to school, is that we're not sure that our schools are actually going to take our safety that seriously, to be honest, right? That there is an element of like, if my kid is if I found out my kid was playing coronavirus tag and I raised it with the school, like what would they actually do about it? Right? So it's better to not engage in that at all. And I think that's part of the reason why we're staying home. And then like thinking about if you're a family that has to use public transit to get your kid to school every day, like in New York City, are you going to risk that right now? Like with all the violence that's happening in our community, that's directed at our community, are you really going to risk your child being exposed to seeing you being hit or yelled at? Like my daughter has experienced it with me, and in fact, like she is scared for me to go anywhere by myself, because a couple of times we were out walking, it was just the two of us. I've had these encounters, and it's very scary for her, right? And so I know for me, like that's, I mean, like we live in a very, I mean, I would say like I'm hoping that it's a diverse and progressive enough district that I feel safe enough to send my daughter back to school. But I can imagine if you don't live in a district where you feel like your schools are going to take it seriously. It's not just about whether my kid's going to get bullied or not. It's about how seriously are they going to take our claims of discrimination and concerns.
Nadia, do you have anything to add to that?
I wanted to know if I could hear a little bit from Estella about what she's experienced with her students, and maybe as a parent as well, if that's all right.
Yep.
With my students, actually right around spring break, when our reopen date was set, I asked my kids, how do you feel? Because not once has anyone stopped to survey you and ask you how you feel about returning. And many of my students, the school that I teach at now, we're in downtown Los Angeles, so we are just in between we're about a block away from Chinatown, a few blocks away from J-Town, and Koreatown. And the public transit came up in that conversation with students where my kids were like, Miss, I would have to take the bus, and not only do I not feel comfortable being on the bus because of COVID, but I don't think it's going to be safe for me as an Asian student to be back on campus. And I don't want to deal with that. So we might as well just stay home. And as a parent, I've kind of been really irritated with my daughter's district because there hasn't been any acknowledgement of the rise in crimes against Asian American families in our community. And we have a large population of Asian Americans in our neighborhood. And I've brought it to board meetings and have said it to, principal. Our principal is Asian American, and I'm wondering, why is there not blanket statements? I'm not surprised, because the statement that got put out at the rise of Black Lives Matter protests last summer was not great, and it did not instill me with confidence then either. So fast forward to this moment, and there still is a lack of confidence, not only in the district I serve in, but in the district that my daughter goes to. But what is clear is that the kids see it all, and they're not okay with any of it, and don't necessarily have um, they don't have an avenue to express how they're feeling about it, or make any changes or have any say about it. And that's what I think hurts the most.
When I was growing up, there were maybe like 5 million Asians in the entire country. And now we're up to like 23 million. So most of us are new Americans. So when I was going to school, I was quite isolated. I was one of maybe 2 or 3 other Asians in my school. And now I think that there are Asian communities in many more schools where they're very used to having more Asian parents. But the fact of the matter is, because we're such a new community, I think that there just hasn't been any attention paid to being sensitive to the needs of the very diverse communities that are new. And then also, because we're new, the speaking up for ourselves is much more difficult as well. So Nadia, do you want to comment on that? What do you think about that?
I mean, I wanted to also share that I was very lucky. I was part of a conversation with the Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, yesterday, with about, I think, 11 or 12 other Asian American parents and leaders and teachers. And it was, one thing that other leaders had shared. For example, there was a leader of an Asian American organization in New York City. And what keeps coming up also is, Sung Young, you mentioned even the harassment you face. Estella, you mentioned about your students' fears. Is that even if there is a mechanism, like we say HIB, right? Harassment, intimidation, bullying. Like New Jersey has that instituted that, okay, if there's an incident, it must be reported. But what happens after it's reported? What are the mechanisms for reporting? And to ask Asian American children or parents to be like, hey, something happened to me, let me speak up. That for many of our communities, that's not a natural thing to do, whether it be cultural or because, as you mentioned, Gloria, some of our communities are newer to this country. There might not be a familiarity with English or our institutions, or having comfort and knowledge, and also things that our families sometimes face that make them feel like they need to minimize what they're experiencing. So even while talking, which it was wonderful to have this direct conversation with the secretary. It was also important that we lifted up that mechanisms, how like, are they effective, and even if something is being reported to the point where people feel empowered enough to report something, then what happens? And the truth is, it falls down so much to the individual, sometimes teacher, principal, classroom, that you can get, I mean, some, like you said, Young, sometimes like your friend's daughter, nothing can happen, right? It's like, okay, well, they were just being funny. And, you know, I will also say that, you know, there's the bullying which is happening. And I know, for example, Muslim American students in the past, there was bullying post 9/11. There was, you know, when in 2016 after the presidential election, the Muslim ban, there was another spike in bullying, and our communities have been facing this. This is not a new phenomenon. However, the fact that at least now there's at least some more attention being given to, or I wouldn't even say attention being given. I'd say it's activists like Young, it's activists who've been doing this for years, really lifting this up, saying attention needs to be given to this because this is not okay and it's getting worse, and we need to really speak up and do something about it.
Sharon, you work with a lot of students and young people, young Asian Americans. Can you speak to that? Like, what have you been seeing among the people that you've been working with?
I mean, a lot of fear and anxiety. And what's really sad is, you know, I hear a lot about, you know, all these parents who are worrying about the safety of their kids. It's mutual. Kids are just as worried about the safety of their parents. I mean, when you see all of these attacks, they're happening mostly to, you know, old Americans. And so they see their parents as the people that are victims and are, you know, targets. And so there's lots of anxiety around that. And I think, you know, if you're an immigrant or a child of an immigrant, you are often, you know, you parentified at a very early age. And, you know, there's a blurring of boundaries. You're kind of looking out for your parents in the same way that they're looking out for you. Oftentimes, you know, you're the one translating. You're the one, you know more about the world than they do. And so I think this kind of heightens that already intense feelings of, you know, I have to take care of them. And how are they supposed to even focus on school when, you know, they're so worried about their parents' safety? And so I think it's just like a mutual just fear that is keeping them from really, you know, just being a child.
So how can schools do better? You know, Nadia, you mentioned that there's some mechanisms, but in general, like how can parents advocate, go to the schools and actually get them to pay attention? And what can schools actually do to create a more welcoming environment and take seriously all of these concerns that are from Asian American parents, but actually all parents, right? Estella, you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I feel like I have a really long list of things that every school needs to do. I think, for starters, schools really need to do district-wide. Like, when we're talking about intersectionality, race, and equity, we have to be very clear in all those conversations that what we are going towards or striving for is indeed equity and not diversity or inclusion, right? Like, it's not enough to have multicultural potluck day and everybody brings them. Like, that's not it. That's not what I'm looking for, right? And to Sharon's point, I was that kid, first gen in this country for both sides of my family. I know what that feels like, and it's not fun, and it's not easy to have to grow up faster than you should while you're trying to just socialize with other kids your age. It doesn't make that easy. And so the schools need to be able to create programs, curriculum, models, etc., with an equity lens and a critical race lens. But those aren't things that we are often taught in teacher training programs, and those aren't things that are often taught in admin training programs. And so I think there is a lot of unlearning that has to happen across the profession, and then some relearning. I also think that budgets show our priorities, and it is very clear that when there are not line items, like pots of money set aside for certain populations of students, that's not where the district's priority is. Like, it's clear. In my daughter's district, there is one Black teacher on her campus, and that one teacher takes on her own, just out of her heart. She's the one who plans every single observance for every single population on the campus. So here she is struggling, dealing with funeral services for a colleague and a dear friend of hers, but everyone's looking at her, you didn't plan nothing for Black History Month. And she's like, okay, I'll get it together. She does. It was great. And then here she is again. It's Asian Pacific Heritage Month, and she's trying to do everything for everybody. And while I appreciate that, I'm constantly talking to the board and the principal, like, that's not her responsibility. I love and appreciate that this teacher is going above and beyond, but stop asking her to go above and beyond. Point blank, that's racist. Like, I need you to not put the shoulder or the weight of all that on this one teacher of color on this campus. And then I need you to go put in some work and find the community orgs, the grassroots orgs, the community leaders who are the parents who can show up and be here for Asian Pacific Heritage Month, if that was the goal to have an event this month. But it also should not be about a monthly observance or some events because the calendar said so. This is content and curriculum that should be ongoing all year long, all the time. I feel like as a parent teacher, I'm constantly at home. I'm like eavesdropping on my daughter's classes. And then when it's dinner time, I'm like, so let's revisit that conversation and like put it in some perspective. And let me give you some other historical facts about who this person was or what they're responsible for. But as a kid, I never saw myself as Samoan in any place or space, right? And the racial narratives as they stand, they don't apply to me. The model minority myth, while it is problematic, it also does not apply to me as PI. Mm-hmm. And so another thing that I think really has to happen, and we all have to push for, is a disaggregation of the data. Mm-hmm. All the time. The checking that box on every AP exam was the most stressful thing for me as a high schooler, because there was no box or place where I got to say, well, I am Nigerian and Samoan, and I shouldn't have to choose, or other nondescript Pacific Islander. And so if we had a real disaggregation of the data, then we could do better about not only reading the data with a critical race lens, but then using it to take steps forward and truly support the populations that are on our campus. How do you know what particular, the API community is so vast as every ocean that connects us. Every religion, every language, and we've been lumped into this small group. And while I appreciate being able to show up for my siblings, my Asian American siblings, and vice versa, the disaggregation of data would help us in so many different spaces and places. How are our different communities faring in terms of healthcare, in terms of COVID, in terms of vaccinations, and what's happening on our school campuses? And without that disaggregation of data, we don't truly know what's up and what steps we need to take.
Thank you. So I just want to take a step back for, you mentioned the model minority, and in a lot of ways, the model minority kind of like clumps a lot of Asians into like one thing, right? Which is why the disaggregation is so important, because, all of our children are unique and they have unique needs. And we all come from very different communities within the Asian American community. But what is it about the model minority myth that is so very harmful? Sonia, you want to take a step at that?
Sure. I think Estella, kind of captured the essence of it, but I think that if I could just put it in a different way, it really invisibilizes our community in a way, and it really just showcases the very successful few that fit a certain type of stereotype that, frankly, the white majority society wants to see us in, right? So even if folks internalize this model minority myth, and that happens a lot in my particular community as Korean American, East Asian tend to lean into that a bit more. What people don't realize is that you're still only fulfilling a stereotype. Like, as Asian American women, you are expected to work hard and be really industrious, but God forbid you want to be a leader, right? Like, and so even if you want to play into the stereotype, like there is a limit. I mean, into the model minority myth, there is a limit. And I think it's really, it is, I mean, I've been calling for it for a while, but it is really high time, especially right now with everything going on and knowing that, the PI community in California have been disproportionately impacted by coronavirus at rates that's like outrageous, way beyond anything any of the other AAPI community has been experiencing. Yet very few people know about it, talk about it, because again, our data gets aggregated, right? And so to me, it's an issue of continuing to invisibilize people, right? When we disaggregate data, and all at the the rationale of it costs too much money, right? It costs too much money to see people as human beings is essentially what they're saying when they continue to perpetuate the model minority stereotype by just looking at aggregated data. So I'll give you one very quick example. And at NAPOF we work on gender wage gap. And when we first started doing, working in coalition, people would say, so we have these things, what's called equal pay day, right? So it's like a full year and however extra month and days it takes for a woman to earn what a white man makes in 1 year, right? And so the national equal pay day was going to be in March something. And then because of our aggregated data, Asian American women are going to be, our equal pay day was going to be in February. So it's like, look, even the women are faring better than Asian American women are faring better than all the other women. Look at them; they make a whole 10 cents more to a dollar than the rest of the other women. Well, when NAPOF disaggregated the data, what we found was that actually the 5 ethnic groups with the largest gender wage gap is actually AAPI community. And you can find the data on our website, because I'm going to screw up if I start naming them because I won't remember them in detail. But, it's the Marshallese, folks from Marshallese Island. It's Burmese Americans. It's the Nepalese Americans who are making something like 51 cents to a white man's dollar, while, we have other communities that over-index and put us in this, again, aggregated data that really disadvantages, in my opinion, the people that need the support, the public resources in order for them to have a level playing field. And so I think that is the danger of continuing to perpetuate the model minority stereotype, both internally as the Asian American community, but also that's perpetuated onto us by the mainstream culture.
Right. And for our kids, right, like the stereotype is, oh, you're really good at math. And that's all part of it. But what if you're not good at math? What if you hate math? I mean, every child is individual, right? And this model minority kind of, tries to force you into something. And if you're not that, like how harmful can that be? Sharon, before we move on to the last question, do you have anything to add? Because, you work with so many kids.
Well, I do want to add a little bit more about the model minority myth, and I think it's important to add that, it really pits minorities against each other. It's a tool that is used to uphold white supremacy, to minimize, the struggles of Black people and say that, well, this is a group that succeeded. So just be like this group and, you can make it, while all the while just totally deny that slavery happened, that that they can just overcome all of that just by working hard and having strong family gaps. So I think that is something that I just wanted to add. But as for children and their mental health, as we all know, children need to know and feel that they're safe, so that they're not in a constant state of trauma and fear, which is really detrimental to their mental health. And I think a lot of times parents, they don't really know how to recognize these signs of trauma, and instead these behaviors come out as, oftentimes the quickest thing that people think is that, my kid has ADHD, my kid is hyperactive. They're so quick to think that, but oftentimes it's actually, a state of trauma. When you're in that survival state, like your heart is beating, your blood is pumping, and how can you even sit still? How can you even concentrate? And so I think acknowledge that these are the experiences that they might be going through, and to help them work through it instead of trying to minimize these symptoms. And instead of just treating the symptoms, we need to treat the actual underlying cause.
So what would be everyone's advice for ally parents who want to show up for AAPI families at this moment?
I mean, similar to what Estella said about the example of that teacher, which unfortunately is not uncommon in any space. If you're the only elected of color, you're expected to handle all of the issues because you're the only elected of color. So you're supposed to handle for all these issues at one time, which it's great if you do, but the fact that you're the only one only adds a burden. So it's like one thing any ally can do in any space, but especially as a parent, is listen, diversity. When we say diversity, or in the case of when Estelle was mentioning these different months, these are months that enrich all of us, right? When you bring in culture and information and knowledge, it enriches everybody. It does help our communities feel definitely more represented, but it also is an opportunity to share, right? To really share together. And so parents, you don't have to be from a certain group to say, hey, like, let me help, or hey, why are we not spreading spreading information and education about these things throughout the year? Like, that should not just be on that one brown parent or that one black parent or that one Asian parent to take it all on and do that. So speaking up for more inclusive learning, that and also if it just comes from one parent, it's just not powerful. If it's a group of parents who are active, vocal, and and united in calling for this, it's very powerful. It doesn't even need to be 100 parents. Even if it's a handful of people, it can make so much of a difference in a district. So I'd say for parents to to learn, to educate yourselves as much as you can, but see how you can show up for others in your community, and make your community and your school district and your classroom a more collaborative and inclusive space.
Estella, do you have anything to add?
Yes, to everything Nadia said. Also, I'd say lean in and get really comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that's for parents, educators, and folks in administrative positions who are making decisions. There needs to be a more distributive way of handing or dealing with power and leadership. And we have to do better at districts about calling parents in, and let go of assumptions. I think the assumption is either parents of color don't care, parents of color are working too much. And while there may be some shades of that could be true, beginning with that assumption is a terrible place to start. Mm-hmm. It could be a language barrier because, again, our communities are very diverse. And if you made an assumption about what language our families speak based on racing them or looking at them, then that's your bad, not the families or the parents. And the other two things I would ask parents and educators to come together and call for is ethnic studies K through 12. It should not have been that I did not see a Samoan face or name in a textbook until my senior year of college. Or, I shouldn't have had to wait to get more than a paragraph on the transatlantic slave trade until, I was a junior in college. Ethnic studies should be something that we are teaching from preschool, kindergarten, all the way through, so that all of our kids get to see themselves reflected beyond the month of May or March or February. I'm
sorry to interrupt you, Estella. We're down to the last 2 minutes. Yeah. So Sharon, do you have 30 seconds for any advice that you would like to give allies?
Sure. I would say it's important to educate yourself on what microaggressions against Asian Americans look like. I think it's very specific. Sometimes it's not as outright as it is towards other folks of color, and so I think parents need to know what it is so that they can identify and spot it and teach their children instead of continuing to perpetuate them unintentionally.
Thanks. And I pass it back to you, Sun Young, to answer that question and to close us out.
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you so much for facilitating and for all of you for being here on this panel. This was amazing. I learned so much and it was such a rich conversation from so many different perspectives. Yeah, I mean, I think I just speak up and listen. Don't count on us to do our work. Please do your work, right? Like diversity and equity and inclusion in this country is not just work of those of us who need it. It's all of our work. So that would really be my call, especially if you're like, I live in a very white school district, more reason why, right, that you need that. So please do speak up. And so as we wrap up tonight, I just want to thank everybody for being here and being part of this conversation, learning together and hearing our stories. We will be continuing the speaker series next week on May 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern. We're hosting a conversation on Asian American women and elected in elected office and people who've run for office. So it'll be a very dynamic conversation between folks who have run for all levels of office, some who have won, others who are still aspiring, and will be a really rich conversation. And we're doing that in honor of Patsy Mink, who was the first woman of color elected to Congress. So please join us next week. You can follow us at NAPAWF, at NAPAWF, or on on Instagram and on Twitter. And once again, thank you to this amazing group for your time today and for your wisdom and sharing your life and life story with us. Good night, everybody.